That's right, yeehaw. How are you guys doing today? How are you so talented? I just like playing. I just played a lot because I enjoy it. You guys having a good Monday? Monday. Isn't that a song? Or maybe it's Sunday. Pretty good so far. Alright, what do you say we get started, people? So little to do in so much time. Wait. Stop that. Reverse it. What movie is that from? That is not from Mulan. What are you doing? Ah, there it is. There it is. I can count on you, TJ. I heard Mulan was a terrible movie. The remake. The original, I'm all for. But yeah, I heard the remake is no bueno. All right. So, I've told you before, I think in my mind, the major goal for studying dynamics of any sort is eventually to achieve control. So when we're studying flight dynamics, we're getting to the point where we have a dynamic model for how the aircraft moves. And now we want to start to connect our control inputs to this. So how can we influence those dynamics and make them do what we want? Okay, so here we go. To control an aircraft, we need to manipulate the aerodynamic forces acting on that aircraft. And the major way we do that is by actuating the control surfaces. And we'll show you these in a figure down below. But I'm talking about ailerons, elevators, and the rudder. So these are all different control surfaces on the aircraft, and as we actuate them and move them, the airflow around the aircraft changes, and that changes the aerodynamic forces. So in addition to those control surfaces, we also can adjust the thrust forces, and that's going to produce some longitudinal acceleration, and that's our primary control input to control the aircraft speed. So let's take a peek. So I snatched this figure from the Anderson textbook, Intro to Flight. All right, so we got the rudder here at the back, and you can, rotate this. And that's going to tend to yaw the aircraft. And the angle by which we deflect that rudder, we're going to call that delta A. Now the elevator, well, we tend to have two, one on each tail back here, but same thing, you can actuate that like a hinge joint. And the angle that will do that is delta sub E. And that tends to pitch the aircraft, rotate it nose up or nose down. And sometimes you can have forward elevators, and that could be on like a forward wing, which we call a canard. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Maybe one of you knows the proper pronunciation, but all that to say, you could have a surface like that even forward of the wing, but usually it's just on the tail. Okay, I got it, Jordy. Thank you. Appreciate it. All right, so we got elevator, usually on the tail, and then we have the aileron on the wing. So that's different than the flap, and this is another hinge joint kind of thing. This can go down or up, and wait, what am I doing? Back here at the rudder, I should have called this delta R for rudder. I don't know what I was thinking. Because the aileron is what we call delta A. And that's the angle we deflect. Now, the interesting thing about the ailerons is obviously you got one on each wing, but this is what we use to roll the aircraft. So what we'll do is we might pitch one of these ailerons down, and then on the opposite side, we pitch it up. And that creates the capacity for the aircraft to roll. So in this case, it would if I put this aileron down on the left wing and the other one up, this wing's going to get more lift, this one's going to get less, and it'll kind of rotate like that. All right, so these are the control surfaces I'm talking about: rudder, elevator, and aileron. And then, either through a propeller, an engine of some sort, we can generate thrust. And the throttle setting we're going to call delta sub T. So in this class, we're going to deal with these four primary control inputs from our perspective. So in system dynamics terms, this gives us a control input vector. And there's going to be four elements to this vector. It's 4 by 1. Delta T, delta E, delta A, delta R. So we'll have our throttle setting, elevator deflection, aileron deflection, and rudder deflection. So we're going to always keep bringing this back to a system dynamics sort of state space context. That's the standard way of organizing these equations of motion and our control input. So keep this in the back of your mind. We're controlling a system by using 4 inputs to modify the applied forces on an aircraft. Okay, but how are these control inputs actually related to the aerodynamic forces and moments on the aircraft? So what I mean is, let's say I deflect the rudder a certain amount. I don't know, 5-10 degrees in one direction or the other. How do I know how much of a yaw moment that actually produces? So here we want to start answering that question. Okay, so let's go back to our aerodynamic forces and moments. So our aerodynamic forces acting at the CG of the aircraft, which we call G, if we project this onto the body frame basis vectors, well, let's start with these forces in the wind frame. So just to recap, we have the drag, we have the side force, and we have the lift. And these are just the signs in the wind frame. So some of these are negative, some positive. Now, if I want to go to the body frame, I have to use the rotation vector or rotation matrix from the wind frame to the body frame. And just to remind you, I think we did this last time, this rotation matrix is going to be a function of the angle of attack and the side slip angle. And we derived this kind of like an Euler angle thing. And somebody asked me the question of why we only used 2 rotations to relate the wind frame to the body frame. But when we did Euler angles, we did 3 rotations to relate the fixed frame to the body frame. So like, what's the difference here? I still don't have a good answer, just to be honest with you. But don't let me off the hook. I want to keep investigating that. Okay, but in the body frame, these forces are X, Y, and Z. So those are the components when we project it onto the body frame. Those are just the definitions we use. Okay, so those are aerodynamic forces. Let's also consider the aerodynamic moments about G. When we project these onto the body frame, we have L, M, and N. And just to remind you, L is the rolling moment, M is the... Okay, I gotta cheat. Well, let's put it on this figure first. I know that... Okay, we'll do the aerodynamic force. We got X pointed along BX. We have Z pointing down. So these are the forces that we're putting on there. And we have Y pointing off the right wing. And then for my moments, I know that L is the moment going about BX. So that makes sense that it's the rolling moment. Y, we have M going about the y-axis. Okay, so now it makes, this is the pitching moment. And then N, we have about the z-axis, so that should be the yawing moment. It produces a yaw motion. All right, so we'll go back up here. Oh, I was gonna mess that up. M is the pitching moment. N is the yawing moment. Okay, so these are the aerodynamic forces and moments, and these show up in our equations of motion. But we manipulate these forces using, like I said earlier, the rudder, deflection, elevator. And so we're trying to say, like, well, how are those connected? So this, the connection point is going to come back to, let's not cut this off, something called non-dimensional empirical coefficients. So generally, we express these forces and moments shown above in terms of what we call non-dimensional empirical coefficients. And so we'll show you these in a second. Now, what does empirical mean? It means derived from experiment. So we're going to get these coefficients from some experiment, some wind tunnel tests, so on. And it's these coefficients that ultimately relate back to our control inputs. So this is kind of our connection point for achieving control. So these empirical coefficients, they are functions of the control inputs, but they're also functions of other aerodynamic parameters like your aircraft speed. But these empirical coefficients are certainly the key to unlocking how much force the control inputs actually produce. So if I deflect the rudder a certain amount, what does that actually do to an aircraft? We're going to be able to answer that by going back to these empirical coefficients. All right, so let's talk about them. All right, so we got the aerodynamic forces. Well, it turns out you can write the aerodynamic force in terms of these non-dimensional coefficients. So let's do that here. This is our first non-dimensional aerodynamic coefficient, C sub x. And then there's these two other terms which we'll talk about. And for y, we have this. And remember, these coefficients are non-dimensional, so it makes sense that we need some extra parameters here because x is a force. So I can't have x equal to cx because you can't have something that has dimension equal to something without dimension. So Q and S are basically some normalizing coefficients that allow the units to work out nicely. So, okay. Cx, Cy, Cz, these are the non-dimensional empirical coefficients for the aerodynamic forces. For aero forces. Okay. Q. Well, let's write mathematically what it's equal to first. But this is dynamic pressure. 1/2 times the air density times the velocity squared. So we can write that inertial velocity in terms of the projected body frame components, like U, V, W. That's the inertial velocity in the body frame. So this is probably the easiest way to actually calculate it. And so, like I said, Q, this is dynamic pressure. And then S, this is just the aircraft wing area. And I pulled some examples here from a cool website. It's called aerotoolbox.com. And I found a couple web pages that they have within that site that are really excellent. So if you're trying to visualize wing area, I mean, here are a couple examples. We have like a Cessna. We got a Boeing 747. So basically, it's the projected area of the wing, both sides, but also it includes the connecting fuselage area, right? Like that middle piece is connected in that area calculation. And that's what I like about this figure, you know. A picture's worth 1,000 words, so this makes it really clear. So I made a little comment here the connecting fuselage between the wings is also included in that wing area calculation. So whenever you see this in a formula, you know, okay, if I'm doing it for a certain aircraft, what am I looking for? All right. Oh yeah, so I wanted to take a second to just verify the units here. So X is a force. Let's stay with SI units. So we got newtons, which if you break that down even further, that's kilograms times meters per second squared. So it's like a mass times an acceleration is a force. All right. And then this coefficient, it's non-dimensional, right? Okay, so I know that Q and S need to add up to newtons. So this was so that's dynamic pressure, which was a density, kilogram per volume, kilogram per meter cubed. And then it was multiplied by a velocity squared. So we got like meters squared over seconds squared. And then S is a wing area, so it's meters squared. So if you multiply all of these terms together, well, you have meters to the fourth on top, meters cubed in the bottom, so you're going to end up with kilograms times meters per second squared. So the units work out. Cx is indeed non-dimensional. And this may seem basic, but I actually, a lot of people get tripped up by this. I tricked myself the other day. I was like, how can this coefficient be non-dimensional? The units aren't working out. And I was just having a brain fart. So it's good to just go through it and just confirm it. Okay. Now, for the aerodynamic moments, we also have some non-dimensional coefficients. So we're going to have CL, Q, S, and notice this, like a moment is in newtons times meter. So I know this CL is dimensionless. If I just multiply this by Q and S, the units won't work out again. I would need an extra meter term. And that's exactly what we do. We have this B term, and I'll tell you what that is. It's the wingspan, but we'll show that below. Okay, so then we got CM, Q, S, and we don't multiply this one by B. We multiply this by C over bar, which is the mean chord of the aircraft wing. And I'll show you what that is too. And then we have C, N, Q, S, and this one's back to B. So we have these aerodynamic moments. Okay, so CL, CM, CN, these are non-dimensional coefficients. Let's be specific. For the aerodynamic moments. And then Q, we know that's the dynamic pressure. We had the definition earlier. S, we have the aircraft wing area. We know what that is. It's the projected area, including the connecting fuselage. Let's talk about B and C over bar. So B, wingspan, so tip to tip. And if you look at this figure right here, this is also, I stole this from aerotoolbox.com. Has a lot of great figures. You just go from one side to the opposite side, you get that length. That's B, the wingspan. Easy enough. The mean chord is not as easy to calculate. So what is the chord? The chord, oh my goodness, is this dimension That's not showing up super well. Let's try this color. Oh yeah, that shows up nice. So the chord is this dimension of a wing. But notice the chord varies along the wingspan. In general. And the chord is going to be thicker or wider, whatever you want to use, close to the fuselage, and then it tapers out towards the wing tip. So when we talk about the mean chord, we're looking at the mean value in terms of how much of the span it takes up. So the mean chord value over the span. So that's not like totally trivial to calculate. It takes a little thought. It's an integral. I guess it's not too crazy, but it's not as easy as just looking at a figure and being like, oh yeah, that's the mean. You got to actually do like a little integral to figure out exactly what the mean is. Okay. So this is how the non-dimensional coefficients are related to the actual aerodynamic moments and forces here. Okay, so we're not going to do this for the moments like we did for the forces, but if you do a dimensional analysis, you'll find out that, you know, these terms do indeed work out to be dimensionless. Okay, so back to the main point. The main point here. These coefficients, these non-dimensional empirical coefficients, are a function of the control inputs, among other things. And this is going to be our connection to figuring out what our control input actually does to the dynamics of the aircraft. So, for example, let's talk about the pitching moment non-dimensional coefficient. So that the pitching moment is capital M. C sub M is the non-dimensional coefficient associated with the pitching moment. Now, when they run these wind tunnel tests, like on a scaled model of an aircraft, or if they do a computational fluid dynamics simulation of an aircraft, they're going to calculate how this parameter changes as a function of many different things. So we're going to see how this changes with inertial velocity for one, angular velocity. So these are the components of inertial velocity and angular velocity projected onto body frame basis vectors right here. Okay, here's the important ones. Like, I don't know, all of these are important. But we want to see how this pitching moment is related to these deflections of the control surfaces. How does my elevator deflection affect my pitching moment? All right, it's also going to be a function of the relative wind orientation, which we now know we quantify with the angle of attack and the slide slip. And it'll also be important as the aircraft rotates, how the orientation changes as a function of time. So it's, and you know, this isn't even the full parameter set that you could do. They run a lot of tests to see how this changes with many different conditions. So some of these dependencies in here are more significant than others. So here's a good example. If you think about the pitching of an aircraft, this is mainly controlled with the elevator deflection at the tail. Okay, so Okay, we're given an example. The elevator deflection delta E affects the pitching moment much more than, say, rudder deflection. Where the rudder is mainly meant to yaw the aircraft. Kind of turn it left, turn it right. Okay, so how do we figure out these dependencies? So here's the experiments. You might have a scaled wind tunnel test. And this is part of the importance of having these coefficients be non-dimensional. Because if you do a wind tunnel test on a scaled model and you test the dependencies there, you want to be able to project that to the full-scale aircraft. Okay, so we could do this using wind tunnel tests. I mentioned computational fluid dynamics simulations. You can also do in-flight measurements. You just get up in the plane, deflect that elevator, have some sensors on the aircraft, and test. We also have some databases that that help us get these. So there's something called the U.S. Air Force DATCOM database. I was checking this out a little bit the other day. I don't know exactly how it works, but you download this software for free that interfaces with their database, and it helps you with calculating some of these coefficients. I think maybe it gives you shared access to some of their computing clusters or access to some calculations that have already been done. I haven't played with it too much, but there's existing numbers that you can grab from. All right. So we're going to use these coefficients to determine how perturbations in control variables affect aerodynamic forces and moments about a reference flight condition. And we're just going to abbreviate that RFC. And when I say perturbations here, it probably jogs your memory. This is suggesting we're working with perturbation dynamics. And that means linearization of our equations about some equilibrium. All right, let's flesh this out a little bit. Okay, first, a reference flight condition. We're going to be working on these over the next couple of classes, but these could be combinations of non-accelerating, which is also known as steady flight, non-turning flight, wing level flight, and there's others, right? But that's all I mean by reference flight condition. We're going to assume some nominal flight pattern. We're going to linearize our equations about that. And then we're going to, using these coefficients, look at how perturbations in our control variables affect the dynamics of this linearized model. Okay. So, whatever reference flight condition we come up with, it's going to imply a set of nominal values for our flight parameters that we linearize about. So, okay, we're going to do a little example. This Taylor series that we're going to look at below, or that we're going to make, it's going to predict how the pitching moment will change about some reference pitching moment m naught. Okay, so this is going to come back to our pitching moment coefficient. And up above, I had this coefficient being a function of many, many, many different parameters. But let's just assume that these are the most important ones. So I'll just say it's a function of a limited set of parameters here. And for our reference flight condition, whatever that is, that's going to imply some nominal values for these parameters. So we're going to call Cm naught our coefficient evaluated at the nominal values, whatever they might be. They'll be different for different reference flight things. But let's just assume that that's what they need to be to satisfy this reference flight condition. Okay. So this is our pitching moment. This is our nominal pitching moment for whatever reference flight condition we're looking at. And if you take the difference between the two, we call that the perturbation in the pitching moment. So the Taylor series expansion is as follows. You got to differentiate the moment evaluated at the reference flight condition and multiply it by the perturbation variable that you're taking the partial derivative with respect to. So I'll just write these out. Delta Q. So this is how the pitching moment changes with the elevator deflection. Can you go a little further into the difference between pitching moment and the nominal pitching moment? Sure. So let's say it all starts with a reference flight condition. So let's say that I make up a reference flight condition that is, we're going to descend towards a landing, right? And we're going to do it at constant velocity. So you'd call that a steady descent. And I can specify like more details about that, whatever, with like specific speed, etc. So the nominal pitching moment would be what pitching moment needs to be applied to the aircraft to maintain that flight condition. Steady descent, whatever speed that is. Now, okay, so that's the nominal pitching moment, to maintain that reference flight condition. I can look at perturbation dynamics about that condition. So what that means is, what if we get hit by like a little side gust of wind while we're coming in for the landing? Well then, I don't know, we might get a little deviation in our pitching moment from this nominal condition. And then assuming we have like a stable system, a stable control system, like the moment will stabilize back towards that nominal condition. So the difference between these two, we just call that delta M. We call that the perturbation dynamics of the pitching moment. Does that make sense? It's like we got the nominal setting, which maintains our reference condition, and then real life comes at you, and you realize that maybe it'll deviate from that condition a little bit at different times. And so there's some dynamics. Okay, cool. And no, I'm glad you brought that up, because we're going to look at, because if we're interested in, say, designing a control system that if I'm coming in for a landing and some wind disturbs my reference flight condition, and it perturbs my pitching moment a little bit, well, probably my control system is going to adjust the elevator a little bit to dial back in my pitching moment to where it needs to be. And so this equation here is showing how this perturbation ultimately ties back in some way to the elevator deflection, among other things, you know. But we're starting to expose these control variables so that I can plug in something here. So are the nominal values constant for the reference flight condition, or will they change with any changes in the regular components? So the nominal values for the reference flight condition will be constant. I think generally, I'm hesitant to say that they'll always be constant, because there's something called a steady turn. And okay, so when you're in a commercial aircraft, and whenever the aircraft turns, what the type of turn they try to do is called a steady turn. And okay, and I'll give you an example of how this works. Forget about a plane for a second. When you're sitting in a car and you take a turn, it's kind of annoying in a car because you feel yourself like drifting to the side, right? Especially if you're not the driver. Like when I was a kid and we're going on vacation and my dad's driving, dude, if you're sitting in the back seat and my dad takes a turn, you're flying around. You know what I'm talking about. So, have you noticed when you fly in a commercial aircraft, when it turns, you don't feel that same sensation. You don't feel like a lean to the right or the left. Instead, they turn in such a way so that you feel that force going deeper into your seat, which is actually a comfortable sensation in my opinion. So the way they accomplish that is, as they turn, they bank the aircraft. You can imagine what I'm talking about, right? Like when you imagine an aircraft turning, It also rolls as it turns. So a steady turn, I was thinking of that. That's a reference flight condition. I'm in the middle of a steady turn. And do the variables, I think even in that, you could define like some constants for this. Maybe there are some reference flight conditions where things are changing, but I think we're going to assume they're constant. Okay. All right, so we're going to work with a lot of partial derivatives in this class, and so I think I showed you this before. Something that is going to make the notation a little easier is we just say m sub u to say this is the partial of m with respect to u. So I'm just going to rewrite this in this way. Oh, geez. And I still want to write partials out anyways. A lost cause. Okay. So that, yeah, this is a lot faster. It's annoying to remember all of the notation, but then when it saves you time writing, you're like, ah, okay. So these things are equal. And I guess when we write this, it's implied here that this is evaluated at the reference flight condition for that problem, whatever it might be. We call these partial derivatives sensitivities because it describes, like, for example, this derivative, the pitching moment derivative with respect to the elevator angle, that should be a relatively big derivative compared to some of these other terms. And so you say the sensitivity of the pitching moment to the elevator deflection is large or something. So we call these partial derivatives sensitivities. Yeah, they tell how much m will change given a change in another parameter. Okay, this is going to come back to those coefficients. So I didn't write this out up there, but each of these partial derivatives is obviously related to the dimensionless coefficient Cm for because this is for the pitching moment, so that's why it's Cm. So let's take one of those partial derivatives. So dm du at the reference flight condition, which we could write as mu. That's going to be d du of. So now I'm writing this in terms of that coefficient from earlier. So this is just the definition from earlier. And we have to evaluate this at the reference flight condition. And we could simplify this a little bit. We'll pull these terms out. And then we'll have d du of that coefficient evaluated at the reference flight condition. So when we do those partial derivatives, ultimately it's going to come down to an expression like this, because this parameter is the one that we have test data on. They did like a scaled wind tunnel test or whatever, so we don't have data on like dm du directly. We have data on this partial derivative, and then we bring it back to like dimensional coordinates by multiplying it by this relevant stuff. All right. let's get back to how perturbations affect aircraft dynamics. Doesn't Q involve U? Okay, because Q, 1/2 rho. Oh my goodness. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And now I don't like what I wrote here anymore. And rightly so, because you're absolutely right. Let's get rid of this. Let's not simplify it that much, because you can't. You get what he's saying, right? We're taking the partial with respect to u, so I can't just pull q out, because that's also a function of u. Thank you, my friend. Okay. Now, I like this next part because we're going to bring a bunch of stuff together from the first few weeks of class. We're going to mesh it all together in a nice way. You're going to take a trip down memory lane. Okay, because we're looking at perturbations, right? And we want to see how these perturbations affect the aircraft dynamics. Well, we're going to need to linearize our aircraft equations of motion. Excuse me. So let's go back and look at them. We have the translational equations of motion, which we wrote them in this way, but I want to expand it out a little bit. Fg is the net force acting at the center of gravity. Let's expand that out. So we have the weight of the aircraft. That's easiest to express in the fixed frame. But because this equation of motion is all in body frame coordinates, we got to use our rotation matrix to express that in B frame components. Okay, so we got the weight. Let's do the thrust. That acts in the BX direction. So this right here is already in the B frame. That's nice. And then we have our aerodynamic forces, and let's just call them X, Y, Z. Let's just put them directly in the B frame. Even though we could write these in the wind frame and multiply it by our rotation matrix to bring it back to the B frame. Okay. All right. So we have our translational equation of motion. This is a totally nonlinear equation at this point. So the only thing I want to point out right here is that the thrust, of course, is going to be a function of our throttle. That's one of our inputs. I'm just going to throw a couple inputs in here just to remind you that each of these aerodynamic forces is a function of our control inputs. So I'm just throwing that in here. So this is how we introduce control inputs to this equation of motion. So that's our translational equation of motion. Let's also go back to the rotational. And there's no way we're ever going to rewrite this. I mean, that's a lot. Okay, but notice we already did the work of our aerodynamic moments are appearing in here. And once again, this is how our control inputs are showing up in this equation, because these are functions of control inputs. Our elevator deflection, etc. Okay, now we're going to go even further, because by solving the equations of motion above, well, what do we solve these equations for? We get UVW, PQR. We're going to get, so velocity and angular velocity. We can, in turn, calculate the resulting pose of the aircraft using our kinematics equations. Okay, so from our equation of motion, from my rotational equation of motion, I get PQR. Okay, that goes in here so that I can solve this differential equation for my Euler angles, and that'll give me the orientation of the aircraft in the sky. Similarly, we have the translational kinematics. So I solve my translational equation of motion to get u, v, and w, and then I use that. I got this rotation matrix. This is a differential equation for the inertial position of my aircraft. Because remember, x, y, and z, that's the position vector. So the point here, I think I wrote, I wrote a little description here. So the above equations describe the connection between the applied forces and ultimately the pose of the aircraft. So the forces and moments, they affect the dynamics. The dynamics affect the kinematics. And eventually, I have a connection between my input forces and the pose of the aircraft. So, I mean, obviously you know this, but this shows via the equations that there's the potential for controlling pose with our rudder, ailerons, thrust, so on. And from all of these equations, we're going to make one large, I'm talking large, nonlinear state space model. We're bringing it all back full circle, my friends. So we know a state space model looks like this. The time derivative of your state vector is generally equal to a nonlinear function of your state vector and your input vector. So once again, this is our input vector for an aircraft. Throttle setting, elevator deflection, aileron deflection, rudder deflection. We got a 4x1 input vector. And the state vector is, well, there's 12 of them, my friends. And they come from the equations up above. So we have the position relative to the fixed frame, x, y, z, 3 states. We have the Euler angles, which describe the attitude, another 3 states. You know what, though? If you wanted to express your attitude in quaternions, you'd have 4 parameters right here. So I guess you'd have 13 states overall. Goodness gracious, if you really wanted to. Okay, you have the velocity u, v, w, and you have the angular velocity p, q, r. So the 12 states, they come from our translational and rotational kinematics equations and our translational and rotational dynamics equations. There's another common state vector, which looks very similar to this, but we'll show the minor modifications. Instead of z, you could use the height of the aircraft. So remember, just the way the coordinate system is defined, the height is equal to minus z. So these Euler angles, those are typical. But instead of UVW, we might use the overall velocity, the magnitude of the velocity, the angle of attack, and the side slip angle. So V equals U squared plus V squared, W squared, angle of attack, side slip. So it's kind of up to you, because these variables are all related to each other. You can just choose one set or the other. So, and then PQR. Okay, so 4 inputs, 12 states. Goodness gracious. And it's a nonlinear state space model. All right, so we're going to work in the coming weeks on linearization. Because for most flight situations, I'm not talking about like a fighter aircraft doing some crazy maneuver. Most flight situations, a linear model is more than adequate. And so we're going to linearize this state space model about different RFCs, reference flight conditions. And generally, these RFCs are going to involve unaccelerated equilibrium points. So, like, often we talk of equilibrium as there's no velocity. Well, for an aircraft, that doesn't make sense. It's not going to be just suspended in the sky. So, rather, we're going to talk about constant velocity equilibrium points, constant angular velocity equilibrium points. So that's what I'm showing down here. Let's say that these time derivatives are equal to 0. And this is the type of equilibrium we're often going to be talking about. So let's give a couple RFCs that can satisfy this. A steady climb. So just gaining altitude with a constant velocity. Steady descent. Losing altitude with a constant velocity. Coming in for a landing, something like that. Or maybe like that steady turn I described earlier. Aircraft rotating at a constant rate. These are the kind of equilibrium points we're going to linearize about. And guys, that's it for today. So I wanted to set this up that in the following few classes, we're going to derive a couple reference flight conditions. We're going to look at what the nominal variables are equal to, like U naught, Q naught, alpha naught. Like, what do you define those to be for different things? And then we're going to linearize this humongous state space model about these points. We're getting there. I think it's cool stuff because it's working towards a practical end. There's all this math and reference frames flying around, but it's working towards a practical goal. I guess that's what engineering is. It kind of differentiates it from pure math or something like that. No offense to any pure math people, but that's probably a difference between engineering and math, the goal of a practical application or problem. So with that, we're ending a little bit early. I'm going to hang around here for a bit. If you guys have any questions, we have homework due on Wednesday. And I think it's our most challenging homework yet this semester, but it's also the coolest homework. It's working with some of those kinematics with a quadcopter. If you haven't started that yet, start today. It's not easy. It's not an easy homework. I have office hours tonight for which class, though? Yeah, I have office hours for flight dynamics tonight. So, if you have any questions, I'm going to be in our Discord channel from 4:30 to 5:30. Take advantage of that. I very rarely have people asking me questions during that time. It's an underutilized time. Yeah, the homework is really cool. I'm getting some weird issues though, like in the quaternion part, I can't seem to get the combined matrix to work, but if I do just the version for angles, then it's spot on. Oh, you mean like Euler angles? It's working out nice for you? I'll give you, so when I did the quaternions, I had to do a fair amount of debugging to make it work for me too. And I'll tell you, a funny thing I forgot, and I bet this will trip up a lot of people, like solving for the Euler angles with quaternions works. Oh yeah, that'll work. Wait, let me pull this thing up. But once I add in the translational part, it breaks. Interesting. Yeah, because you can do the rotational part just on its own, right? But the translational depends on the rotational. Wait, so you're saying... Interesting. Why would that happen? You basically have this, right? My best guess is a typo. Oh, no, the thing that I was going to say, what I messed up, because you're using, like, for the quaternion angular stuff, you're using this equation, right? Dude, what I messed up, you can't forget this 1/2 out in front. This equation works for you? Okay, cool. But I bet there's going to be a couple people who are like banging their head against the wall. You got to remember that 1/2. This equation works for you, but the really big one, you mean the combined, wherever I put that guy. You mean like this thing? This is giving you trouble. Did it work for you when you were doing Euler angles? The combined dynamics? Because you got to do this one too, right? Did that one work for you? That one didn't work for you? Because definitely do this one first before you do the quaternions, I would say. Yeah, I was trying to figure out the quaternion one first because I got part of it working. Okay, well, I mean, it's... Interesting. Do you have the right rotation matrix? Well, okay, something... Because remember... As you're solving, the reason these have to go together is because you solve the rotational dynamics for the Euler angles, and then the Euler angles have to go back into this rotation matrix. So you got to be updating that matrix every iteration. Hey, what's up, Uncle Bill? Yeah, maybe you're just not updating the rotation matrix or something like that. Okay, yeah, check that. We're sending a little Z to the chat, followed up by a Franker Z. What other dog emotes do I have? think this is a dog. Oh no. We got a corgi. Let's see. All right, people. I think I'm going to close it out for the day. I hope you have a lovely rest of your Monday. I'm going to try to do the same. Adios.